What's up, brother? It's your boy, Mike Muse, from the Conversation of Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be in conversation with my next guest. I had the chance to meet this brother in Puerto Rico, and we were there for, let's say, about 4 days together, and every day was with a group, and we were shuttled around in these Minty Sprinters. I wouldn't call them actual, maybe they were buses. I think they were coach buses. But one time, I think it was maybe after breakfast, we were going to an excursion in Puerto Rico, and I sat next to him, and I was like, you are the most fascinating man that I have met in a very long time. His conversation was extremely stimulating. And then next thing I know, I learned that he did this incredible feat. And it was at a point where I had to force myself to sit with other people just because I couldn't get enough of a conversation with this brother. But this guy, the guy I'm talking about, Tom Turcich, has wrote this incredible book entitled The World Walk, 7 Years, 20,000 Miles, 6 Continents, A Grand Meditation, One Step at a Time. And I was like, I got to get you on my show, and we got to talk about this because he is the 10th person to walk around the world with his dog Savannah, who has since passed, but she became the first dog to walk around the world. Again, I want to repeat that. The 10th man to walk around the world, which is insane. Do you get it? Do you see why I sat next to him every single day while in Puerto Rico? Without further ado, my guy Tom. What's happening, Tom?
Thanks for having me. I'm pumped to see you again. Missed you.
You are the most fascinating man, and you have not disappointed. I keep watching on Instagram, and like, it continues to be fascinating.
I felt the same way about you. I was like, I got to keep hanging out with this guy. The conversation is so good. And that was in a group of very interesting people. And I was like, I got to keep hanging out with Mike.
And you stood out, my friend.
Yeah.
But first, congratulations on the engagement.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was exactly a week ago in Paris with my former girlfriend, now fiance.
Yeah.
Proposed under the Eiffel Tower. I met her on the walk in Washington, and then she kind of stalked me. She followed me around in Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, all over the place. And, we just hit it off, and it's like a nice transition into the next chapter. It's a sort of seamless transition.
Now, why did you do it in Paris? Because you traveled all over the world. Talk to me about why Paris. I feel you're very intentional. I don't feel like you do anything haphazardly.
Yeah, so we are living in Kentucky right now, over the Ohio River from Cincinnati. My fiance is doing her emergency medicine residency at UC, University of Cincinnati. And we don't feel super attached to Cincinnati. We know we're just there for a brief amount of time, and we're going to move back to Philly to be with the family and friends and all that. So I didn't feel right to propose there. Paris is her favorite city. She's been there a few times. I've never been there. And randomly, there's direct flights. Yeah, no, I walked around it. Went around it because I was always, walking through cities was always so stressful.
Oh, yeah.
And even though it would have been fine, it's a very calm city, but walk around in the countryside is a little more peaceful. And randomly, there's direct flights from Cincinnati to Paris.
That's random.
And so it's just like a 7-hour flight. I booked it without her knowing, and I kept it all secret until we got to the airport, and she saw the sign, Paris. She started crying, and and then we're in Paris, and it was incredible. We had a great time. We were there for 6 days, ate a lot of good food, and so I think I just wanted it to be. The engagement is something that's like one of these few points in your life these meaningful points in your life that you have actual control over. A lot of other big life events just happen randomly. And with this, I want it to be intentional and make it something beautiful. So that was Paris.
Now, when she saw the sign that said Paris, did she know what was about to happen?
She must have.
Yeah.
I'm like, come on. It's a surprise trip to Paris.
How many days afterwards did you actually pull out the ring?
It was like 3 days afterwards.
Oh, you kept her in suspense.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to. It kept keeping me in suspense. It was killing me. I feel like I'm generally pretty composed. I don't get too nervous, but when I got done on I don't even know what I said. It's such a big moment. You get much more nervous than you realize, even though I knew she was going to say yes.
Yeah.
It was.
I've been having a lot of conversations. I'm kind of shocked that you said you had a fear. I was having a conversation this morning around the idea of fear and how fear can lead to paralysis, and it makes us not want to step up and get off the couch, right? Like, was there any fear associated with you when you said, I am going to walk the world? Because fear just sets in with me at the idea of even saying that, and I have no intentions of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely fear of dying, of something happening, of, being kidnapped or taken advantage of. I mean, that was all running through my head. But I think the way that I overcame it was that I knew what a life in the opposite direction would have been. It would have been me not pursuing my dream, and knowing myself, this kind of seed of bitterness probably would have taken hold, and I would have just held on to this regret. So when I compared the two, it felt like, well, I'd rather live this life that maybe is riskier, but is aligned with my values and what I want to live. And so even if I did get kidnapped or murdered or whatever it is, taken advantage of, at least it would have been doing, this thing that I found very fulfilling versus living, at my parents or in Philly and kind of living this quiet existence. So I think I just got over, and I did have fear. I remember before leaving, I'd be laying in bed thinking, I'm going to wake up in El Salvador one day. And when I went through El Salvador, it was the most dangerous month in its most dangerous year in its recent history. It was very violent when I went through there. And before I left, it was violent. So I'd have these, I'm going to wake up there. I'm going to wake up in the deserts of Peru. This is so crazy. I can't even imagine this. But then the walking is kind of so slow as well that solves some of the fear as well, where you have time to process things. It's not like you're flying in to Mexico or El Salvador or wherever it is, and then you just have to immediately acclimate with, no internet, no wherewithal, anything like that. The walking is so gradual where you do have time to adjust and you have time to get a feel of the culture and the language. And so the fear that you have maybe is dampened a little bit by the ease of the transition.
Audience, this reads like I don't know, I'm thinking like a Liam Neeson movie, right? Like the fear of being kidnapped, the fear of being tortured. All this is real, audience. This isn't even hyperbole, because there are so many dangerous places in our global society and the country where even our Department of State recommends individuals not to be able to go to. And yet here you are just walking with your dog through this. But what was your North Star to want to go beyond the fear of being kidnapped? You talked a little bit about your Constitution, but what is it that was driving you to make you overcome the idea of like being kidnapped or murdered in
I think oddly,
Salvador?
it was like counterintuitively, I think it's the fear of death is what was motivating. Even though, afraid of getting kidnapped and afraid of dying, I also even today live with this kind of constant fear of dying. I think about it most nights. I go, man, I'm going to die one day. And so feeling the shortness of life and feeling like I didn't maximize my life, I didn't live a life that I wanted to live, that is like the primary motivation. And the walk around the world, that stemmed from my friend dying at 17 and then me really reflecting on, okay, what do I want out of life? I got one shot here, wanted to travel, wanted to be forced into adventure. I wanted to grow out of myself. I wanted to understand the world, and walking solved all those things. So that was kind of like the North Star in the sense of, how do I make the most of life? And that was the answer. And so, yeah, kind of counterintuitively, the fear of death is kind of pushes me towards taking more risks towards death in a certain way, because just trying to be alive.
Yeah,
trying
it's
to feel
almost like
something.
the moth to a flame, right? Like you're kind of gravitated towards it, right?
Yeah.
And then almost tempting fate, right? And then almost tempting fate makes you almost feel more alive, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely part of it. And then it's also, I think luckily I have this baseline of belief in humanity. There are dangerous places, of course, and you don't want to walk through, Central America. It's just a dangerous region. You don't want to walk through it as like a babe in the woods. You don't want to go through totally naive and, walking around at night with, a Rolex on and your phone out and, music playing or whatever. You want to be smart. But also my dad is like a humanist. He loves people. He's like a golden retriever. And I think he gave that to me, where he just believes in people. And so I believe that setting out that most people would be good. And it bore out. Once I was out there on the ground, meeting people, you just realize over and over and over again, this place is new to you, and it could be scary because you don't recognize the houses or the streets or the food. But for the people you're walking by, this is their house, and they know every little corner, and they know their neighbors. And so what is new to you is just someone else's home that you're passing through. And that became more and more reassuring as the years went on.
To stick with Salvador for a second, just
Yeah.
because I think, audience, you're very well versed now on what's happening in Central America, the migration that is happening heading north. We've all heard the political dynamics and the geopolitical tensions that are happening within these countries that are making individuals want to take this dangerous trek that we've all been hearing about up north to go through it. I love how you said that your dad always believed in a sense of humanity. And I love that idea, right? And there's been so much that can happen that can make us be jaded with humanity, right?
Yeah.
And not see the best in the humans across the board. To stick with Salvador, what did you learn when you walked out of the border of Salvador? Like, what was some of your takeaways?
I think it was one of the primary takeaways was just like the state is pretty weak in a certain way, in the sense of not being able to fully enforce its security aims. I remember in Honduras, the country after El Salvador, I met a few guys who had lived in America and then it got deported back to Honduras. And ahead of me, there was like this kid who was probably like 14. He was on a moped and he had a shotgun around his back and he was like being paid by the local government to, be like a policeman office, like essentially.
At 14.
Yeah, I mean, he could have been, maybe he just looked very young, but yeah, young guy. And the guy I was talking to says, you could pay this guy $10 and he would walk away from anything. And so I think that's, one of the primary thing that you need to form a reliable state or reliable country is security. And it's a really easy thing to take for granted because it's usually just in the background. When it's secure, it's just in the background and you don't think about it. But in some of these states that are more poor off or that have a large, drug trafficking, contingency, that have a lot of power, a lot of money, are willing to resort to violence, it subverts a weaker state. And so, and El Salvador felt like an example of that. And it makes you feel grateful for growing up in New Jersey, in a place where I never feared for my safety. And, like in general, the law is going to be enforced and people have this belief in that security. And so I think, walking through El Salvador, it was a little bit more of an example, it felt like, of, a state that was struggling to kind of secure itself and then have time to build its identity and build, a stronger state.
Well, let's keep on this journey to Honduras.
Sure.
Now you enter Honduras, you're recognizing the implications of not having a secure state, not having that sense of calm, not having that sense of ease, not having the sense of access to things that are basic infrastructure needs to keep a society going.
Yeah.
It's not like you're about to enter Europe.
Yeah,
right?
No.
So now you're entering Honduras.
Yeah, and Honduras was very hot. That was the first thing. I was just scorched. And I think the last day I was there, I slept in this I got a hotel almost every night in El Salvador and Honduras. Because at the time it was 1 and 2 in violent crime in the world. And I didn't have any money, but I was like, I'm going to spend it on these hotels just so I sleep well. And sometimes I walk 30 plus miles a day to get to the next hotel. But on the last day in Honduras, I was kind of up in the mountains, make my way to Nicaragua. There's no way I could get to a hotel. And I found this little structure to sleep in. And I'm about to fall asleep, and some guys pulled up, basically, and this man appears kind of out of nowhere with a machete. And he thought I was there. He thought I was robbing some of his cattle. And the day before, he had some people take his cattle. And, maybe that's like a small example. And he ended up being very nice. And he was like, oh, it's just some gringo, some guy here who's, sleeping here. You can sleep here. But it was just another, example of this guy was getting up at 11, 12 o'clock at night to go and, protect his little property and what's making him money, because there's not that, ultimate reliability in the state doing it. So it's just another example of that. But yeah, getting through Central America too, for me when I was walking, was just a whirlwind of trying to comprehend so much at once. I walked through the U.S. on my own. It's my own country. Figured out how much water to carry, how much food to eat, all these little things, the basics. But then in Central America, I'm still learning the language. Everything looks a little differently. I'm feeling like I have this, this danger over my shoulder always. So I lived in like this really heightened sense of existence for a long time. I remember going through these cities and I felt like I was using 100% of my brain. My brain was like maxed out. It was stretched to capacity. And I get through the city, navigating these moto taxis and push carts and just people and things I didn't, fully comprehend and feel comfortable with. And then I'll get to the countryside and be like, oh my gosh, finally I can like breathe a little bit. So yeah, Central America, it was this really formative and like intense year of walking. And then also, I mean, it's the pinch point, like you said, like, globally, it's this pinch point that leads up to America. So in a larger scale, you get all these people hoping to live in a better system, and they all passing through this very narrow little stretch of land.
Audience, I just want to just remind you, you are already informed of what's happening in Central America. I talk about it all the time, but even when Tom was doing this walk, Central America was at its peak and height of drug trafficking, of gang violence, of human trafficking. There was no social media at the time highlighting these stories and narratives, right? There was no national mainstream media news highlighting this. So a lot of these entities were operating in the dark, right? In the corner without the world spotlight on them to make them more aware that, hey, we're watching. Hey, there's a thing happening. Hey, you might want to think twice. You were doing this right when there was no spotlight on any of these type of cartels or entities that were happening. So again, I asked myself to ask you, what was that made you say, what am I doing?
I mean, I had that thought all the time, that what am I doing out here? But it was just sort of inertia. Once you're doing it, then you're doing it, and you kind of have to see it through. But again, there is that, it's slightly more, I mean, it is more violent. It's a slightly more violent region of the world. There's a greater risk. But also, if you looked at, even the like San Salvador, which was the most dangerous city and the capital of El Salvador, I think it was like 61 to 100,000 was the violent crime rate. But they think that the average medieval city was about that, or was probably even higher than that. So over the course of time, right now, the most dangerous city is still safer than, the average city 500 years ago or 600 years ago, whatever that. And then also you just realize, like, most people just want to live their life. And of course there's violence, and you don't put yourself in, you try not putting yourself in a bad situation. But majority of it, it's just some kid walking to school. It's just parents going to work and, making smoothies and making pupusas. And so that is the vast majority of the world. And of course, like, it's the media's job, and this isn't like derogatory media. It's like, this is anything you write about, anything, you film, anything you talk about. You want to talk about something interesting, and you want to talk about, the things that capture attention. So you talk about, whatever is interesting, and majority of that is some sort of conflict. That's where the story is. You're not going to talk about 10,000 people living peacefully in a village.
You're not. And obviously you went to 6 continents, but I'm just so stuck on this. For me, I think the Central America, for me, is a crux of your whole walk. Because like you said before, United States is easy. Touring through the mountainsides or the region of Provence, right? It's beautiful, and passing lavender fields is absolutely gorgeous, right? But there's something about what I'm enjoying this conversation is the dichotomy of humanity, right? Versus like what we perceive as beautiful in lavender fields doesn't make the gang-laden areas of Central America any less beautiful, right? Because of that. And I'm just thinking about your father in this space of finding humanity. Did your father's words mean anything different to you after you concluded your Central America piece?
I think they just bore out, which is, my dad never traveled that much. So he had a good sense of the world. But yeah, I just think they bore out. But also, like I said, I mean, and I think you're right. It was like the crux of the walk. And I'm very glad I did it at the beginning, because I was naive and sort of on fire enough with the idea of walking around the world that I was able to like be brave enough to get through that. And I think if I had done it later in the walk, if it was the last leg, I would have psyched myself out too much. Oh man, this is like, it's every country, but Costa Rica is in the top 15 of violent crime rate. I would have psyched myself out. So to get it over with in the beginning, that also was the sort of approval, the self-approval that, oh, you can do this. You walk through Central America. Now it's downhill from here. And it South America, I had a lot more space. I was walking in these remote mountains in Colombia and Ecuador, and then in the deserts of Peru and Chile, and I had a lot more time to reflect and think about myself. But I think I was afforded that by the first year just being like this fire hose of survive and get through this. There's
a saying out there, and I'm going to attribute Tiana Taylor, the singer, but I'm sure this is a quote or a poem or something. It's about a rose from concrete. And I'm just wondering if we can come back domestically to here, United States. Have you thought about certain dynamics and narratives differently in the sense of humanity here in the United States, right? And all the roses that could exist in the concrete. And
Yeah, I mean, a lot. I mean, I started the walk in the U.S. and I ended the walk in the U.S. So I left, one perspective, travel the world. I come back with a totally different perspective. I think for me, one of the most frustrating things is, well, there's two primary things that really frustrated me when coming back to the U.S. is like the private property is the obsession with private property and the protectiveness around private property is like unlike anywhere else that I've been in the world, especially out west where you have like the cattle ranches and stuff like that. And compared to, say, I was in Scotland and they have the right to roam and you're just kind of wandering through the land and people are pretty friendly and they assume that you're good and that you have the right to pass through there. And then camping in the U.S. and being in these really beautiful landscapes in the West, like incredibly beautiful that for during Native American times it was like unfathomable that anyone would own this land. It just wasn't even a thought. And then not being able to find a place to camp like in my own country or camp peacefully or without fear of someone finding me and harassing me or whatever it is. And so I think that was really frustrating to come back and be like, man, and Americans are so friendly. Americans are really, really friendly and really welcoming and very generous. But I think there is this sort of baseline of suspicion that exists, this baseline of protectiveness that exists, and it doesn't exist in other places. And then I would say the other thing that was frustrating is like the prevalence of guns, because you just have to have that in the back of your head all the time. And it's the same with the police officers. The police officers start with the assumption that this person could have a gun, so there's a slight more defensiveness and less of an assumption of, hey, I'm here to help you. Maybe there's some misunderstanding here. I first have to make sure that I'm not going to be attacked and then go from there. So I think those were the two things that coming back, I realized, man, this is, it made for, and America's so beautiful. America's as beautiful as anywhere I've been, truly. Like the American West is insanely beautiful. But I would say those two things were, I think, jarring after coming from other parts of the world and that not being the case and seeing that there's other ways to do it.
There's a lot that the world can learn from you in this walk, beyond just what's in this book and just in his word, in these words within the book, is that you have had such a lived experience and you've been able to see so many different types of governments and functionalities of governments, and some governments that I would put in quotation marks. Are they really even functional governments? And I always talk about this very frequently here on the Mike Muse Show, is a sense that sometimes we just don't have an understanding because we don't get out. Like Americans just don't travel, right? And there's nothing. Look, I'm not putting a morality claim on that about that, but because we have such limited dynamic and exposure, and because we think America is just the end all be all, and there's no other country I'd rather live. I am a patriot. I call myself a patriot. But there's so many other parts of the world that we can really learn from. And just something you just said right now, this idea that Americans have about protectionism, right? We think we always say, right, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Like, how free are we? Even within the space of just the line of you saying how much private property exists, right? This isolationism, this nationalism, this protectionism that creeps up in ways through policy, and don't get engaged with the policy dynamic right now, but it creeps up in ways of these policy and political spaces because of these moments, and that you have literally just unearthed that. I wasn't even thinking about that, but for you to say that, what I'm coming to mind is, wow, here's this brother that has traced so many parts of America and has noticed the idea of the amount of private property, right? And that really leans into exactly kind of why America feels such this idea of protectionism and nationalism, right? And this idea of guns, right? Even you have said, you have done Central America, you've done El Salvador, right? You've done Honduras, the most violent countries in the world. And yet even at home, there was a fear in a place where we think our democracy is so amazing that protects us and keeps us safe. But you had this feeling of unsafety. And then in Europe, they have so many guns too as well, but yet you don't see the level of mass shootings that we see here, even with the number of guns that they have over there too as well. Don't respond, but that just really, audience, puts into perspective the dynamics and the thoughts that run so true through ideology. And if we don't bring awareness to this, how we can find ourselves in places where we could become undemocratic without even realizing it because we're being so protectionist with it. So thank you for bringing that perspective into it. I wasn't even thinking that about that with you on your journey, but that exactly is your journey. I have a question I've been thinking about, and even just looking at you, And I think it's because I've had this idea of this conversation I had this morning about just pure fear and like paralysis. For some people who are listening to start a big endeavor, because this is a huge endeavor. Like this is beyond me, right? I wouldn't even know where to begin, right? I was a Boy Scout, but I didn't even get my Eagle Scout because I'm like, for what, right? Like I'm not doing that. How do you map out logistically something like this, such a big task? I think the way you answer could help the audience who are thinking big, whether it's a big idea, starting a big company, starting a new venture, quitting their job and this jumping out the window to land to a not literal audience, metaphorically jumping out the window to start something new.
I think a lot of it is you have to begin. That's the main thing. And that sounds like an oversimplification, but logistically, you have to have, for me, some sort of monetary base, enough where I thought, okay, I could walk for 2 years, bleed out my money, and then hopefully get a sponsor. And then, from there, the walk would be taken care of. But before I began, there was nothing assured about it. And you can only plan so much, especially with a thing like walking around the world. It's not like I could map every route that I was going to take. I had these bike maps that I thought were going to take me down to Florida. Like the second day in, I realized they were terrible and they're going to get me killed. I was on these windy Pennsylvania roads. So I was like, all right, throw those out. Got to figure out the next thing. So I think a lot of it is just beginning and failing, but having a general sense of direction. So for me, it was, the ultimate goal, walk around the world. But then I was able to narrow it down to, okay, the first year how do I get down to Panama City? And then even smaller than that, it's like, okay, how do I get down to, the bottom of Texas and then into Mexico? And so I think, you start with these small flags, these small little goals that help you guide your purpose and take step by step towards them, that little purpose. But then within that, just be willing to fail. Failure is not like, you shouldn't be afraid of failure. Failure is the growth. Like the failure is a good thing. And especially failing in the direction that you're aiming towards. You should want to fail in the direction of your dreams. That's the goal. Fail in the direction of your dreams. Anything else, you're just kind of, wasting your time. At least in that way, you're growing in the way that you want to grow. So I would say be a little bit reckless in a certain way, set some general goal, some general aim that maybe is a year off or 6 months off, something like that. And then start flailing and banging against the wall and trying to work your way into that direction.
Fail in the direction of your dreams. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Fail in the direction of your dreams. Failing for you in this moment, was it getting lost?
Definitely getting lost, losing toenails, being scared. I started with this massive ice cream cart basically that weighed God knows how much. It broke 3 times in the first month. And then I got a different cart, walked all these, dangerous roads before figuring out what roads to walk. And it was there's a million little failures. I had the wrong tent, things broke in the tent. I had the wrong sleeping pad, there's a million little things. But I knew the direction I was going in and I knew the direction I wanted to go in. And so those failures kind of just become these little hills. It's not a wall. It's not this thing that stops me. You go, okay, you get over this and you realize it kind of goes on forever. Like there's always things that are going to be failing and going wrong. But if you're going in the direction that you want to go in, then they become much more kind of acceptable, even embraced.
I mean, honestly, just think about what he just said, like from carts being broken toenails, right? Like, and you still kept going. Right. I think that's such a good testament for people just to keep going and figuring it out as you go. At what point, something that's always struck me is the idea of you sleeping in cemeteries. Talk to me about when you decided that sleeping in cemeteries is the next strategy. Because I don't think you started out this journey saying to myself, I have to sleep in cemeteries along the way. But audience, I'm asking this question specifically because there's moments we have to adjust on the fly.
Yeah, the cemeteries were actually just a great solution. I mean, it's something that you would never really consider. But in Central America in particular, they were an amazing place to sleep because they're just outside of town, they're on a hill, and they have raised graves. So you're totally hidden, it's quiet, and also no one's coming into the cemetery at night. And you can find a little spot away from the graves and kind of, not disturb anything and not be disrespectful, but get a great night's sleep. And so this was kind of this gradual progression of, I remember at the very beginning, I didn't know where to camp and I would look for these patches of woods and gradually I realized, okay, I can get away with a really small patch of woods and sleep pretty well there, and kind of no one would come in, especially in America. No one's out at night. Everyone's watching TV at night. You can kind of sleep wherever. No one's going to bother you. And then someone told me, oh, like you should sleep at a church, sleep behind churches. And oh, okay, churches is another thing. And so you kind of gradually figure out what makes a good spot to hide away for 8 hours. And the cemeteries, especially in Central America, like solved all of them. And so I'd sleep just outside town. The next morning, I'd walk 30 minutes into town. I get my coffee and my breakfast, have a good start to the day after a good night's sleep. But yeah, it was a lot of, it's a lot of little lessons that add up to figuring out, okay, this is what works.
Tom, as we wrap, this is a big question, so I want a mindfulness of like how to edit it down and your answer. But the idea of failing to your dreams, once that dream has been realized and you return back to the States, what is that feeling? Because I'm trying to give that feeling for the audience who may be thinking about their dream, and some may be on the road right now to failing towards that dream. What does it feel like when it's realized?
I mean, the 3 months after it was realized was like cloud nine. Nothing could go wrong ever. I was just floating for months and months and months. And also, I think with the walk, it was this thing that I almost chained myself to because it's such a big dream, and I had to give up so much to do it. It meant breaking it off with my long-term girlfriend, and no Sunday dinners with the grandparents, and not getting drinks with friends. You sacrifice a lot to do it. And so there's also this great sense of relief once you get there and you go, oh, all right, now the world opens up again and you can figure out something else. But yeah, I'd say for the first 3 months after, it was cloud nine. Everything was glowing.
Wow. Tom, I can talk to you all day. You just have to come back to the Mike Muse Show again. There's so much more to unpack. Your stories are very vivid. And I didn't have any questions pre-written, but where we went, I wasn't expecting to go. And so thank you for going there and being willing to talk about humanity and how humanity is related to so many geopolitical dynamics that are at play currently right now in our systems, all because of just the unawareness of humanity and the thread that connects us all, or that doesn't connect us all. So ladies and gentlemen, please make sure you go get this book, The World Walk, 7 years, 20,000 miles, 6 continents, and grand meditation, one step at a time. Clearly you won't be disappointed, or just keep re-listening to this interview because it is wild. I felt so many emotions with that. So Tom, thank you for being a great human.
Yeah, such a pleasure talking with you, as always.
Yeah.
Love it.
Until next time, folks. Peace.